Hi everyone, welcome to the Granite Mountain Movie Club. Thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, please subscribe, like, leave a comment, all that stuff. Today we're talking about Oppenheimer, the 2023 film from Christopher Nolan. We have what I think is a really interesting discussion, largely about the history and politics of the era. And, really, I'm not seeing this conversation happen anywhere else. I've been looking for weeks for podcasts and reviews of Oppenheimer, and I think a lot of the stuff that we get into is just is not coming up anywhere else. So please stick around and enjoy, and thanks for listening. First, we've got Lafayette Lee. I'll let everyone introduce themselves in a second, but I'll get to the names first. We got Lafayette Lee joining us for the first time. We've got Degree Studies, and we've got Dr. Bennett with us today. So anyone who's listened to the show before knows this is a great group. Lee's first time here, but you probably already know who he is if you're listening to this show. And today we're talking about the new movie Oppenheimer. Just came out July 2023, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. So we'll get into it in a minute, but how you guys doing?
Pretty good.
Good.
Excellent.
Now both Lee, you've written something about Oppenheimer that's coming out soon. Do you want to take a second to promote that? I should have this episode out by tomorrow, which would be Thursday the 3rd. But maybe your article will come out about the same time.
Yeah, thanks. I wrote a review for IM 1776, which should be coming out pretty soon here. And the piece mostly focuses on, I give an overview of the film, but I also go into a few things that I think are lacking. Overall, I think the film is pretty great. I'm not going to lie, but I do feel like it does the audience a slight disservice that I don't know if other viewers will pick up on like I did, but I do focus on that in the piece a little bit. And so I'm sure by the time this airs, the review will be posted over at IM 1776.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. And I'll put the links over there. Everyone absolutely go check out IM 1776. I think you guys have some sort of option to subscribe. I encourage everyone to do that. Support people who are doing cool things. All right. So yeah, let's just get straight into it. So this movie, I don't want to say it was a surprise success because it's Christopher Nolan. He's, in my opinion, kind of one of the only guys doing big movies for grownups right now. And he's kind of one of the only guys who can get big projects made that aren't like a Marvel movie or something. And but though that said, I think there was some pessimism about how well it would do financially, but it's doing pretty well. I think it's at about 420 million right now, and that's only after about 2 weeks. And I think there was some concerns that it would even pass 300 or something, but it's doing really well. Universally beloved by critics. It's to the extent we care what they say. And I'm pretty confident it'll I don't know that it'll sweep the Oscars, but it'll get nominations in pretty much every major category and almost all the technical categories. And I think Best Picture, Best Director, Lead Actor, Supporting Actor, they'll have nominations in all those, and probably some big wins too. I don't see anything else.
Sound design.
Sound design is a lot. I think they've won that one already. I don't know. Dune will probably have some stuff there, but yeah, it's going to be. Anyway, it's a success. No, there's no other way to put it. It's like a hit. It's a success commercially and critically. So I want to hear about your viewing experience because, Nolan makes a big deal about the viewing experience. There's a particular way he wants you to see it, and I'm the same way. If you're not listening to this podcast in IMAX 70 millimeter. If you're not listening to this podcast at a 70 millimeter screening, then just turn it off. Just go do something else. Because this podcast was meant to be heard in IMAX. But yeah, tell me about your screening experience.
I was joking about the sound design because I could not hear the dialogue for like a quarter of this movie. And he did this with Dunkirk. He does this with Tenet too. A lot of these movies, like he's recording everything through I don't know what he's doing, but like he's got just the droning and the thrumming and the noises on top of the dialogue all of the time. And that was the only like technical frustration I had with the movie. Everything else about it was great.
What kind of theater did you see it in?
Yeah, I may have not seen it at the appropriate type of theater. I don't remember, but it probably wasn't the right kind.
Yeah, it's so one thing that I've heard, and I don't know if this is true, but I'm guessing it is true because and Degree Studies and we saw it together, and I think we could agree that the sound was okay. I think I had asked him a couple times what some of the lines were, but that's just sort of normal, like actors mumble or whatever. But so what I've heard is that Nolan designs his movies for the IMAX audio, and so if you see it in IMAX, it's generally pretty clear. If you don't, I guess they don't bother to remix it. I don't know why they wouldn't. I don't know if that's true. That's what I've heard.
Well, granted, have you heard, like, I feel like I've heard people talk on movie podcasts how, like, modern movies in particular, maybe like the past 15 or 20 years, there's like really dense sound design. And so sometimes when dialogue is happening, there's just a lot of other noise at the same time. And I did sort of feel like that was going on at certain moments. But yeah, for most of the movie, I could follow it.
Yeah, and the another issue, and I think that's true. I think a lot of things are just not carefully made, and then also people are consuming on like laptops and phones and cheap TVs and stuff, and so they aren't getting like maybe it was mixed for a better sound system than most people are actually using. Another thing with Nolan in particular. Oh yeah, go ahead.
If it's being done to stick it to the pores, I can completely understand and respect that. That's totally fine.
Yeah. So another thing is that he's filming on these IMAX film cameras, and they're huge. And I've heard that when you're in person, because it's got a huge film reel in there and it's spinning very, very, very fast, and it sounds a bit like a lawnmower. So the dialogue is captured, and maybe it's not the purest audio. So it's just kind of an issue. So they throw a bunch of music over it, so you don't hear some of the issues with the audio.
Yeah, that one of the things that I enjoyed about it, even though I did lose some of the dialogue during it, I felt like it was a kind of like a sensory feast, which some people do not like the way that he weaves the music in, with the dialogue, where it can kind of drown things out and be really ominous and just kind of sit right on your shoulder. I really enjoyed that. I felt like that added a lot of heft to the film, where I was a lot more absorbed. Like, people complained about, the visuals of the atomic bomb, but I felt like the music filled in a lot of gaps where you couldn't really use images per se, during the film for every type of scene. And so some people don't like that. And I've read several reviews where folks complain about that, and I respect that. I can understand it. For me, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But I could just be a peasant over here, But I like that part of it.
What kind of did you see it in, like a great IMAX theater, or did you just kind of see whatever was available?
I just saw it at whatever was available, and so there was some of that where I couldn't catch all the dialogue. And then there was some there's grinding that, the quality of the sound in the theater probably wasn't the best. And so, but it still produced an effect that I felt like drove it home in a way that I appreciated.
Yeah. And the reason I'm so curious about this is because Nolan has been really very insistent that you see it, and his preference would be that you see it on 70 millimeter IMAX, which means there's an actual film reel projected, and it's also on this massive screen that has an unusual aspect ratio. It's kind of more square. It's much taller, and he's been very insistent about that because he felt like that's the way it should be seen. And my takeaway now, Degree Studies and I went And the funny thing about a lot of the better IMAX screens are actually like they're at like national parks, or like they're like quasi government run. Like they're kind of like public private things. And so we went to something like that, and it was a very nice big screen, and it was, I hadn't been to one of those for a normal movie in a long time, and it is kind of unusual because it's very tall. It's a very tall, like tall looking movie. But anyway, my takeaway, that despite Nolan's insistence that you see it in this format, my kind of mini review right after seeing it was that you don't have to see it that way. I mean, he really wants you to. A lot of reviews say you must see it in the proper format, but I'm kind of not in that camp. I don't know if Degree Studies, if you felt different. I'm trying to see it again, and it'll probably not be that same aspect ratio, but curious if you had a thought.
Yeah, there were times in the theater that it was like a little too tall.
Yeah.
Maybe in scenes where there was a lot going on in different thirds of the frame or whatever, like the top part was a little elusive. But I thought it was a good experience. I guess I didn't think about in the moment, what would this be like in a less fancy smancy theater. But I'm pretty happy we saw it in that context, because I sort of felt like overwhelmed by the sound and the visuals. And, that very much seemed like part of the experience to me. So I was very happy with the context in which we saw it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say, the true 70 millimeter IMAX that Nolan recommends, there's actually not very many of those theaters. So, I wouldn't say it's worth driving more than like an hour to make sure you see it in that setting. But everyone has like a normal IMAX around them, maybe try that. But if not, I mean, just go with whatever. I think it'll work in any format. But Lee, you gave a little bit of about what you thought of the movie, kind of a brief review. Ben, I'd like to hear from you, your kind of brief review. And you recorded a podcast the other day about maybe some of what's overlooked historically. Really good podcast. Really provided a lot of context for me, and I'll link it from here. I think I'm kind of thinking we'll spend more time on that in the second half of this conversation, but I'm curious, just as a movie, what your reaction was.
Yeah. As a movie, it's great. And I think part of what was so compelling to me about the movie was that it showed somebody that I think of as a bad dude, traitor to his country, in a way that was very relatable to me and to people that I know and care about. And my personal experience of sort of being hauled in to answer for my crimes, I could feel a lot of what he was going through, and it was very compellingly portrayed. I think I would agree with you that there's probably like 20 minutes of total runtime where the overwhelming sensory experience is relevant. It's like crazy psychedelic like blasts of sound and visuals, for like a fraction of a second, and then it's people in rooms talking. And so I will say, I thought that the sort of sensory choices were really interesting and conveyed very well his psychological state. But yeah, overall, I mean, really, really interesting movie. And it's rare that I consume like shit lib content that makes me angry that I also find interesting and like worth watching. I think just in general, I think a lot of us liked the libs more when they could make movies that we liked and music that we liked and like just sort of culture they were good at culture, and so we would like tolerate a lot of things. And this felt like that to me. It was like, oh, okay, like I can see the appeal. I can see why we put up with you guys for so long.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Degree studies. What I mean, I think I already gauged. I mean, I already kind of knew you basically liked it, but I'd love to hear your first take.
Yeah, the phrase that was going on in my head that I think sort of relates to what Bennett said, and that I've thought about Nolan before, is like, if all liberal world order propagandists were this good, I'd still support the liberal world order. You know, like it's
Yeah.
He's good at telling these stories and immersing you in them. I think that one of the ways I was able to sort of exit the politics of the movie and enjoy the story for itself is, I think, part of the movie you can almost like get rid of the specific context and view it more as just like a story about brilliant creators, and sort of think of it as like, is it possible to bring something important into the world and retain control of it? And on that basis, I thought it was like a very timeless portrayal of, how one could be convinced by their own brilliance or whatever, that like, you almost have an obligation to God or the world to use your brilliance to create whatever you can, and then sort of the frustration of having the thing you created taken away from you. And I do think there's, I'm not going to do like a version of the Barbie takes where I say this movie is secretly based, but if you can sort of get away from Oppenheimer being a communist, there is a certain like, I wouldn't necessarily say the movie is anti-bureaucratic, but it is like, it shows that like there's no personal strength or personal intelligence that allows you to navigate these systems, these complex institutions, and get what you want from them. Like, I think part of why I was able to enjoy the movie is I was sort of thinking like, yeah, whatever Oppenheimer's politics were, the system would have used and destroyed him in exactly this way, because like that's sort of what it does. And I think on that basis, as like a classical, like a tragic hero narrative, I thought it worked really, really well. And it also like worries me about Nolan that he can make such a schizophrenic movie that's like half music video, like a
Yeah.
fair amount of the scenes are just like random images and sounds, and there's time jumps like every few minutes, and it feels totally coherent to me. And like it makes me worry about my own brain that I can accept storytelling in that format, though maybe that just speaks to like, his talent as a filmmaker. I don't know. But yeah, I really thought it was great and enjoyed it. And, I won't get into this too much just because it's like weird, but I did mention to you guys that, I had a grandfather who was a physicist and worked on some related things, and who was also sort of a communist sympathizer, which I think was a very common thing for sort of mid-century science guys. And so another element of the movie I liked is it felt like, almost like exploring the perspective of this man in my family that, I didn't know that well personally, but I've heard a lot about. And so it was like additionally interesting on that level.
Yeah, I think part of the thing about the crazy editing and the time jumps and why you're still able to make sense of it, I think of that as like, visual language or film language. And it is crazy that we've seen so much stuff at this point that works. And then of course Nolan, I think, is doing it about as well as anyone has ever done it. But it is weird. And I think this might have been a Chuck Klosterman book, but he talks about, I think he actually used Tenet as the example. No, not I think Inception. I think that's the example he used, where if you showed that movie to someone, from the 30s, they just wouldn't have the language to even process it. They would just think they were watching like random scenes or something. There was no actual film there. But one kind of probably the biggest criticism I've heard, and I want to get your guys' takes as to whether this is like a fair or accurate criticism. But probably the biggest criticism I've heard is that the movie's 3 hours, and and I mean this is a spoiler zone. We do full spoilers on this podcast, so you've been warned. I think at the 2 hour mark, like almost exactly, is when we actually get the Trinity test. So we see the bomb at the 2 hour mark, and there's still another hour. And basically, the third hour of the movie is kind of courtroom or Senate hearings for a Senate confirmation, and then like this weird procedural hearing for a security clearance renewal. So, and I've heard quite a few people say, like, well, why do I care about this? I'm wondering if you guys have a take on that. Like, should people care about that third hour? Like, should the movie have kind of just ended, had a 20-minute denouement or something? But what do you guys think?
I think the third act is the movie. That's what the movie's about. The bomb itself is the stakes around which the real drama is hung, which is about essentially, well, it's about losing your country, and it's about losing your institutional protection and having the rug pulled out from under you. And the bomb is just sort of the context for that to happen to this character. And the way that procedure is manipulated to take away his defenses, and the way that his characteristic weaknesses are recognized and deployed against him. And like I said this on the podcast, but like there's that meme of Oppenheimer, like with his head in his hands, like, oh no, what have I done? Like, the reason that meme is funny is that if this were a movie about a guy who spent like 4 years building a bomb and then was like, oh no, I built a bomb, that would be a stupid movie. Like, he would be a stupid person having a stupid conflict, and it would not be like, what did you think you were doing? And like, that's what makes the meme work. And so like, if you go in expecting it to be that kind of a sort of crisis, psychological crisis that he's having, and that's what the movie's about, I don't know, that seems silly to me. What, like, and I think ultimately they need to tell that story a little bit so that they can come up with their explanation for the change in Oppenheimer's position on the bomb. But, and I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit later, but that's one of the things that I find really unpersuasive about the narrative of this movie, is that he had a sudden crisis of conscience and then became about nuclear disarmament. I think that he just had a crisis of conscience about it not being used on Germans.
Yeah. I'm not in the camp that takes much issue with the third hour. I think the whole thing works from start to finish. Although there is a part of me that would really like, or I wouldn't have minded, or I think it could be great if the movie was just a Manhattan Project movie, that was 2 hours and 20 minutes, and that maybe had a little bit less of his early life and a little bit and less of his his post-bomb career. But I think the end works. It is less of that. It is less of the music video, and I think someone called it, and maybe they were partly referring to Oliver Stone's JFK, but something like it's like an action movie but with dialogue. Like the dialogue is the action. But Lee, I'm curious your take on this, like the third act.
I didn't mind the third act. There's been a lot of criticism about how it was handled. Some people couldn't follow it. I felt like it was done very well. I think this film is very artful. Only somebody with the kind of skill and ambition of Christopher Nolan could ever pull this off. So I think I think it was done well, but I also, kind of agreeing here with Bennett, I did take issue with some things that I think, like I said before, I think does the audience a bit of a disservice. There was an opportunity here with this film because of the implications of the bomb, and to provide a little more honesty about what not only Oppenheimer was dealing with, but what the nation, the American nation, and its transformation, rapid transformation at the end of the war, and what really precipitated that. There was an opportunity and it was missed. And I think, although Nolan is very ambitious, maybe this was just reaching too far, because there's a little bit of flattery of the audience in this film. The story of the bomb is also the story of the birth of the national security state, the end of the American nation as it was known before. And really this is hinted at throughout the film, as he's hauled before a security clearance review. And we all know, like, there's a predetermined outcome, right? Everyone knows this. But there's these brief moments where Nolan allows the audience to come up for air and hold on to, like, this mythos. There's a scene where I think his name is Rami Malek. He's one of the scientists. And he has this, like, showdown with one of the senators, and then, spills his guts about, some of the behavior of Levi Strauss during this. There's another where I think the most off-putting for me was at the end when they talk about senators holding out on the confirmation of Strauss, and they mention JFK's name.
Yeah.
To me, that was just such a slow ball. It was just kind of a coach pitch to the audience. And I just felt like that was a huge missed opportunity, because, how I perceive this is, I think we are still grappling with what happened in, that moment when the bomb was dropped. Not only were we dealing with, Soviet espionage, we were on the brink of the Cold War, which some people sounded the alarm, but there was a lot of naivete. There was a rapid transformation of what our government, what America was after this. And I felt like Christopher Nolan had the opportunity to address this, because this film will stand as a monument for that period of time. I don't think any other film that will be made after this will quite stand up to being a monument to this, to tell the story. But instead of trying to probe some of these really difficult questions, it's not about how many people were incinerated by the bomb. The deeper question is, like, what does this say about the nature of the American civilization? Where it will go from here, the lies it will have to tell itself. And one of those lies is that that there's this, the victim, this naive scientist, slightly naive, idealistic, he's punished by this system. And really it kind of represents like a peasant, these peasants, the American ignorance and hysteria and all that of McCarthyism. That whole thing is kind of the lie that liberals have to tell themselves so that they can avoid the deeper questions about what it is that we're dealing with now, that we have like this operating system of a government that really doesn't have anything in common with what came before that bomb was dropped. And that's the deeper question. Where do we go from here? And so it's, we try to find we try to cling to this like myth that, there's like these intrepid, progressives or whatever, that are radicals, or, they're, these sweet artist types that are going to be able to like champion us through this moment. And like, that's not true. That's not like, the funny thing is that security clearance review that Oppenheimer was, when his clearance was revoked, was the exact same year that McCarthy was censured by the Senate. They felled two individuals. Like, if it was the age of McCarthyism, why did McCarthy, the champion, banner, he was carrying the banner of that whole thing, he was sacrificed at the altar too. Why didn't, like, the better story would be, how do we explain two of these people were were crushed at the same time. This was the same year, and I feel like that's Nolan just doesn't quite want to go there because, he has to flatter his audience a little bit. You know, we're going to still cling to this so that we don't have to face the facts. We don't have to face where we're at because of this moment. I felt like that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, one big criticism of the third act I've heard is there's a lot of exposition, and I don't actually think that's a super fair criticism because they're doing procedural stuff in quasi courtroom settings, and that's always going to be expositional because it's question and answer about events and stuff. Some of the stuff with the actors, I think it's Alden Ehrenreich. He's the guy they tried to cast as Han Solo in the Solo movie, and that didn't work. But he's the one who has that JFK line, and Degree Studies. I don't know if you noticed this, but I noticed that there was numerous people in our screening that gasped and laughed when they heard the name JFK, and it was. Part of me says, these are cow people. These are cattle people who need to be fed at the trough of pop culture references that they actually understand. And then part of me is just saying, well, I guess Nolan is like, these people sat here for 2 hours and 45 minutes and they didn't even know the name Oppenheimer 6 months ago. So I'm going to throw them a bone. I'm going to give them a name they have heard other than Einstein. So, but I do think that was the dumbest. The JFK thing was the dumbest part of the movie, but it was also, I guess I also kind of get it because he's got to make his money back.
Yeah, I think I was one of the people who levied the third act criticism, and I'm sort of taking on board what Bennett said. I think if you zoom out and sort of think about what clearly Nolan was trying to do with this story, you have to sort of accept that structurally this makes sense. But for me, the third act was the only part where the movie sort of broke kayfabe and I didn't understand what I was watching anymore. I think I might have even turned to you at one point and been like, they dropped the bomb and won the war. Why do we care if he retains his security clearance? We've moved from the biggest stakes in the world to really small potatoes. So that, and there were a couple other moments in that act. The JFK part was one of them that I thought was really sort of childish. And I guess it's almost like if you think of this film as propaganda and it's good enough art that I don't mean to demean it by calling it propaganda, but I would say all the stuff that focuses on Oppenheimer's life and the Manhattan Project and that part, it's sophisticated enough propaganda that you're immersed in it and accept it. But with the JFK thing and the Rami Malek scene, it took me out of it a little bit where I was like, oh yeah, now we're at sort of grade school propaganda. The nerds are winning in court against the jocks and the truth, the truth will win the day. It just seemed kind of dumb. And there was one other scene like that too that sort of took me out of the movie, which is when, I don't know if it was supposed to be the Secretary of Defense or who, but when the guy said, we're not going to bomb Kyoto because it's culturally important and also because my wife and I honeymooned there. That was just sort of a cheap shot, I thought, beneath the rest of the movie. There's a lot of characters that the movie is not sympathetic to, but it still portrays as non-buffoons. Casey Affleck's character, they even give a little color that if you know about the history of Russia, you're like, okay, this guy's hardcore because his family was chased out by the communists. That line about Kyoto, I just thought was sort of beneath the rest of the characterization in the film. And then this is sort of Nolan would never do this because it's a different movie. But one thing that did occur to me is we talked about sort of what more interesting versions of this movie would be. And if you wanted to make a really triumphant version of this movie, I think you could have made the third act about the hearings in which Oppenheimer like encouraged them to allow the export of isotopes or whatever it was, because that's like an interesting inflection point, like the moment where he humiliates Strauss and that makes Strauss mad at him, because it's like, the whole first two acts is about Oppenheimer not really knowing how to navigate the institutions effectively enough, to control his creation. But then in the subsequent hearings about export controls, he is like more cynical and more of a veteran of politics, and he apparently does manipulate the other political actors to get his desired outcome. So if you wanted to make the film sort of about Oppenheimer becoming a more canny political actor, that could be like an interesting third act. But I think what Nolan wanted to do, and again, part of the reason why the third act doesn't work for me, and like Lee was talking about this, is the movie has a very tragic view of the individual creator, but then at the end it's juxtaposed with this sort of childish view of governance. So it's like Oppenheimer's life is complex and tragic, and at the end of it he's up on the cross, but like democracy wins because the nerds band together. So like Oppenheimer might be tortured, but like America is okay. And I think as Lee sort of intimated or stated, like that's not what happened to our country. And so I think it would have been more interesting if the political narrative as well as the personal narrative had like a subtler characterization.
Yeah, but I know. Well, I know it's a little bit silly to do the like what's Nolan's what's his secret agenda here. I do think though that the crescendo of the stakes of this movie, I think it does make sense if you are calculating the stakes as a very self-involved and spoiled guy with Asperger's who's like personal, like it's about me and it's about my life. Like I think the movie really inhabits like Oppenheimer's self-concept while understanding that he was like very, very bright, but like kind of naive and self-absorbed in a lot of ways. And so, the fact that he doesn't get his clearance renewed and therefore can't, continue this political, this project of activism and celebrity that he's been pursuing. I think that is the sort of the apex of the stakes and his tragic downfall. But I guess a lot of this gets into like how seriously do you think Nolan takes the surface level narrative that Oppenheimer was the good guy here, but we can get into that later, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because even with the last scene with Einstein, it's like he sort of the last scene sort of does imply like even though there's like this triumphalist, democracy winning with the nerds upending Strauss, there is this other aspect to it where it's like Oppenheimer knew what to do about nukes and we didn't listen to him, so maybe we're all going to die. And like, I don't want to be glib, but there could be like because I think, the national security state is bad and wrong for a ton of reasons, but I'm not sure that one of those reasons is that nuclear bombs are inevitably going to be used again. And I think I can imagine there are some neocons out there who are like, get fucked, Oppenheimer. Like, deterrence works. You were wrong. Like, even if you weren't a communist, you were a pussy. And like, you were just singing the song of like, no one had the discipline to control these things. And like, we navigated the Cold War and we're all fine. So like, what are you crying about?
Well, yeah, it ends with him being like, oh, Alfred, that thing we were worried about lighting the world on fire. Turns out we actually did. And it's like at that moment in time, I guess he honestly, thought nukes would be used regularly or in one single catastrophic event or something. But I mean, yeah, to date, as of 2023, like Strauss and Teller were right. Am I right? Like they were correct, weren't they?
Yeah. Yep. That, and that's kind of a that see, and I think this is where Nolan could have gone further. Is like that exchange with Einstein kind of annoyed me as well. One of the reasons is because it's just accepted. Hey, we're on this continuum of progress. It's I handed the torch to you. You will hand it to somebody else. We're all these tragic figures that no one will listen to us, and will eventually be sacrificed by a bunch of peasants who don't understand. But somebody will get the torch after you. And my argument would be who got the torch after Oppenheimer if he's really the torchbearer for this. And I would argue that no, like we have seen a major stall in the kind of work that was being done. I know in physics there has been a major stall that has happened after this period, right? We have seen the United States become a global empire. So there's a lot that came along with that, but there's a lot of those imperial concerns that are conflated with this notion of progress. And I would argue that we're getting a comeuppance on that right now, and that this it's really a stupendous moment, right? The revolution in physics that's going on at this time. We haven't seen anything remotely close to that. There's no indication that that's coming. And as he's getting, and this goes back to the him getting grilled in front of the bureaucracy, right? It's kind of like it goes back to this same problem where let's foist this on the herd, the American herd, right? And it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, this is why like McCarthy, and I don't mean to talk about him so much. He's just a really great scapegoat because, it's like this populist reaction to communist espionage, which was a real thing, by the way. Like Oppenheimer, while he was on the Manhattan Project, was meeting with people that were recruiters for the KGB. He wasn't meeting with actual KGB agents himself, but he was meeting with recruiters. For whatever reason, that's another rabbit hole. But the whole point is that was a security concern at the very least, right? So like it makes sense that he would get hauled before this body and grilled. But the thing is like this, everybody by the end of the movie hates the bureaucracy, right? And we have this hope that like a guy like JFK can come and change everything. The scientists, the nerds can unite and stand up against this terrible machine. But like it's foisted on the herd, the American herd, the peasants over here, that like that's the bureaucracy is them. But that's not how it is. Oppenheimer and his contemporaries at that time, like the people occupying these positions within the administrative state were just less intelligent Oppenheimers, right? These were people polled during the New Deal. They were polled during the war. Many of them had been in college, whereas most Americans had not. So like a lot of the Americans that are going over and getting shot, in the infantry are like the kind of people we're talking about. And yet the guys in Washington, the people building the atomic bomb, people doing their part in the universities, like they represent a completely different class. And so when he meets with Einstein, it's almost like let's foist this back on the herd as the herd rejects us, doesn't understand us. But that's not, it's the world that has been created by these types. I just don't, Nolan could have made this a case of, where are we now? Can we really look back at this moment and say that the torch was passed? Has this whole thing failed? These are the kind of questions I think in 2023 would be most compelling. And maybe that's a little too far afield there. I mean, maybe people wouldn't watch a movie like that. But I felt like it was dishonest slightly, And I know that that's like common, that's the popular narrative that everybody accepts. But I don't feel like it's truthful.
Well, Ben, I was just going to say real quick before you go, I kind of muzzled you earlier, but we're kind of on this now already. So go full into like some of the stuff you brought on your podcast. It's cool.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think what's timely right now is not really nuclear war. Like, I don't think there are really that many people who are experiencing like nuclear anxiety and like that's why this movie got made right now. I think the substance of the third act of being sort of caught in the gears of the security state, that's way more salient. I mean, I guess maybe I'm just talking from my perspective, but like, it seems much more relevant to the kind of people that Nolan might be interested to talk to, and so I guess like, if this is a movie about Putler and democracy in Ukraine, and I don't know, like that seems stupid to me, and I don't think Nolan's stupid, and I think he's smart enough to recognize that. So what Oppenheimer and those guys represented was this push toward rationalism. I mean, that's what it meant to be a communist, essentially, in like the 1920s in America. Was trust the science. We're gonna defer to expertise and reason and logic and facts and math, and we've already figured out how to use math to make really efficient, electrical grids and communications technology and internal combustion engines. And now it's time to apply that same process of rationalism to human interactions, economics, psychology, sociology. And that's essentially what it meant to be a communist in those days. So, like, of course, it was extremely appealing to the academic class, because it was like, we're going to make you the philosopher king, and everything will be right because you're going to be put in charge. And I think and that's like really appealing, not just to them as a class, but also to the temperament of like the guy with Asperger's, who's like really good with systems and really bad with people. It's like, well, what if everything could just be a glorious crystalline system? And so basically the sense in which I think the not the McCarthy, but the Red Scare was legitimately unfair to guys like Oppenheimer is not so much that they weren't communists, because they were, or even that they weren't coordinating with the KGB, because I believe they were. It's the fact that they were being hung out to dry for being too autistic to manage the pivot from like good old Uncle Joe, we're all in this together to fight fascism, to like, now Stalin's the bad guy, communism is bad, you're not a good American unless you hate communism. Like, there were a lot of elite progressives who seamlessly transitioned from being, essentially communist, essentially sort of whatever it meant to be a right-thinking progressive at the time, which was, to kind of carry water for Stalin, to like, oh, well, I'm still a liberal, but now I'm a Cold War liberal, and I'm very deeply concerned about the humanitarian ramifications of Soviet communism, and so some of the things that Oppenheimer says in the movie, and this is why I do get a little bit schizo about, like, I think Nolan knows what he's saying here. Like, the parts where Oppenheimer is like sort of, he doesn't articulate his actual political beliefs very often, but the kind of stuff that he does say is basically like the bomb will, usher in a new era of global cooperation. And this is a guy who, through the back channels, is clearly like in coordination with the Soviets and would like to share this information with them. Whether or not he did, he clearly felt like he ought to be allowed to. And
that is what those people thought at the time. Like, I think it's not expressed in the movie. Sorry to interrupt you, but like, there were many scientific inventions from these sorts of guys where they were on record saying, one of the things that's important about this invention is it will drive home to the unwashed masses the need for global governance, and then their disappointment that didn't happen.
Right. And which like, and if you understand that Oppenheimer's views on that were widely held in the Roosevelt administration, then the picture that emerges is essentially like Moldbug's view of what World War II was about, which is basically two communist governments splitting the planet between them. And
yeah, and when Bennett, when you say Oppenheimer failed to manage the pivot from communism to post-war, Cold War liberal or whatever, I think so. What you're saying is when the suicidal art hoe calls you, but you're already married and have kids, you don't have to go meet up with her. Is that what you're telling me? Because
that's exactly what I'm saying.
That might have implications for my own life. I got to be honest.
Yeah, and there is like there's like a selfishness that's almost innocent about a guy like that. It's like he's so oblivious to the emotions of other people that like you almost don't get mad at him on the same level, because it's like, well, he just doesn't understand that he's not allowed to do that.
Well,
and
quite a few scenes in the movie where he's like, and I listened to an interview with the guy who wrote this book, the Kai Bird. But in the movie, there's quite a few times where like Lawrence comes in the room and he's like, why do you have all these commie kids in your room? Why are you hosting a commie meeting? Like, you can't be doing this. It looks bad for the department and stuff. And he's just like, oh, it's just a meeting. It's free speech. Like, he's like kind of naive, I guess, about the whole thing. They portray him that way at least. But Kai Bird says, Oppenheimer was Kai Bird insists he was actually pretty apolitical. He got swept up in causes, and he would donate money through communist channels or something like that. But Bird insists he was just sort of like just I don't know if naive's the right word, but just apolitical and just wasn't thinking about it in a savvy enough way. But
no, I think that's true. I think essentially that sort of naive getting swept up in causes up to and including trading nuclear secrets. Basically, what I think happened was the situation in the Roosevelt administration in these sort of elite environments. The cooperation with the Soviet Union was so, and by cooperation I mean Gibbs. I mean just giving stuff away to the Soviets for decades. Was so widespread and so routine that like I think probably in their heart of hearts, most of those scientists on the Manhattan Project who gave things away to the Soviets recognized that they were doing something underhanded that they needed to be careful about. But I don't believe, honestly, that they saw themselves as really out of step with the administration.
No, totally. It reminds me of sometimes when I think the only thing we can compare it to is sometimes when Americans who are spying for Israel get caught, they sort of evince this attitude of like, what's the real transgression here? Like we're hand in glove. I'm just like, I just have two employers, but like at the end of the day, they're pointing in the same direction. And I think that is what the atmosphere was like in the Roosevelt administration. And I think an interesting dynamic that is like not even revisionist, because this was taught to me by shitlib high school teachers, is that like, communists, like relatively open communists, could rise high in the Roosevelt administration. And I think an interesting dynamic that's not, you sort of just outlined it, Bennett, but an interesting dynamic that the movie could have referenced, I think, without sacrificing much, is that it's like, it wasn't so much McCarthyism. It wasn't about like a Red Scare or change in the public. It was almost just that you had this one administration that had an unprecedented willingness to coordinate actively with like a very dangerous rival country and to not view people with relationships to that country and the ideology it was spreading as a threat, but view them as an asset. And then when that administration left and you returned to a more historical norm, those people were in dangerous positions. And as you said, like a lot of people could see what was going on and manage the pivot. But I think it's there's sort of like a very interesting superstructure to, because the movie would sort of have you believe like, oh, a person like Oppenheimer and with his political connections would normally not rise in U.S. government, but he was so singularly brilliant that like these smart bureaucrats knew they needed him. And it's like, no, that's not true. When he rose, it was fine to be a communist, and then it wasn't.
Right. Right. And I think Israel is the right analogy, because you've got, if you're talking about sort of the progressive faction, the progressive wing, the Roosevelt administration at large, it was like at the most cynical, it was like Stalin's our mad dog, and he's the means by which we're going to implement American policy in Europe. And then on the sort of more idealistic side, it was what's going on in Russia, the collectivization and industrialization of Russia is what we're really about. And everything that we're doing, and like what we want to do is make sure Russia succeeds so dramatically that it will be obvious what needs to happen here. And I think that was explicit for a lot of these people. It was Russia is the test bed for what we're trying to implement, which was not necessarily like, it was not obvious to those people that it was going to lead to long-term like immiseration and inefficiency. And like now we sort of, if you're still a communist, it's like you sort of have accepted that like immiseration is the price you pay for equality, but you resent wealth so much that it's worth making that sacrifice. But back then it was like, this may actually work better than capitalist economics.
No, and this is coming back around with AI, because what they do and what the Soviets were doing is they always say the reason central planning didn't work in the past was lack of technological development. But
right,
now that we have more compute, it'll work and be better than everything else. And like that is sort of I mean it's different in a lot of ways, but that is sort of like what some of the sort of like people who are very bullish on AI say. They'll be like, yeah, no, this thing will be able to ingest all information and come up with proper solutions. So like it's not that like liberty or whatever is actually important. It's just that we lacked the means to effectively coordinate everything. But I wanted to say, Bennett, about your sort of Oppenheimer being selfish thing and like childishly naive. It is funny, of all people, Kantbot had a pretty good take on this, where he was like, he had some tweet where he's like, it's so funny that Oppenheimer was like mad with what they did with the bomb, because there was one person on Earth who could have made it not happen, and that was Oppenheimer. So it's sort of like, and Lee was talking about this too, it's like the technocratic two-step, where like you actually make the moves that make the new world possible, and then you like retract from it in horror, and you're like, the people aren't doing with this what I wanted them to. But it's like, right. That's very much like not taking any of the responsibility for bringing the thing into the world.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. The whole thing about being childish. I mean, isn't this like what we always see? Is it's like, I'm a tortured genius. I'm this artist. I'm kind of a gift to humanity, to the like lower life forms. But like what I unleash upon the world is actually deserved, or the failures of my genius, of my planning, are really, this is just really exposing the sins of the people I was trying to help. And, it seems to me like this is, it's so obvious now, because we see this same thing from our political class all the time. And we saw this throughout COVID, where it was like, the failures, which, the American people as a mass have really no say over what's happening at all. But that, it's so fast to find that mass and scapegoat the mass when because you really you can't taste your own cooking, you can't face your own music. It's like it's always, everything has to be shrouded in like benevolence or genius, when in reality there's a selfishness and a childishness. There's arrogance. I mean, this can be a good and a bad thing. I mean, I would argue that you would never be able to pull off a Manhattan Project today. I mean, the speed that they were able to do this, the ways that they were able to, I mean, as even though eventually the bomb was stolen, I mean, they were able to operate with pretty good security for the time, compared to other areas, of national security at that same time. So but I just don't think that the bureaucratic malaise that they would experience today is just, there would be no overcoming that. I mean, people might say Operation Warp Speed. I just don't see that. That's nowhere close to what this is, in my opinion. So it's like, you're really seeing like the end of a dying world, and this new world that we're all living in, and this is in the shadow of the bomb. But this was built by people that kind of have that same attitude, and they're empowered in this world that we live in. And I just find it funny that this film has to you have to keep beating up that scapegoat, because we can't really face who we truly are, as a group. Because we're really living in the world these types created, but they don't want to take ownership that they created this world at all. It's got to be foisted on. It's the sins of these people. I mean, this was really the heart of communism, right? I mean, it's like all of my crazy agricultural policies that are so devastating are really because of the counter-revolutionary forces, or because of the stupidity of the mass, or whatever else it is. And I see the parallels are just so strong to this day and age that we live in.
Right. And it's like,
sorry, go
why
ahead,
would
Ben.
he, like, Nolan is smart enough to know that those people are running those levers of power now, and that they are responsible for, they didn't invent this bureaucratic malaise, as you call it, but they made it worse. They made it much stronger, and it really, I have friends who are, not significant to national security, who are under tighter scrutiny than apparently Oppenheimer was, and it's like. And I don't think it's necessarily.
Yeah, Oppenheimer would have been kicked off Twitter for sure.
Oh yeah, unambiguously, obviously.
For DMing underage girls.
Probably for for tweeting "kill the boar" too many times, maybe.
Yeah, and so I have too much respect for Christopher Nolan to think that escaped his notice.
Well, I wonder.
Do you think, Bennett? Sorry, I just want to ask this question because it did occur to me. You said, Bennett, that nuclear weapons aren't really pertinent now, and I think it asked the question, what is this movie really about? And I was thinking, was Oppenheimer sort of the first expert who transitioned into his real thing, being a bureaucrat? Because I think even more disastrous than bureaucracy has been the insertion of so-called experts into these bureaucracies, because I actually do think they're different skill sets, and they call for different characterological profiles, and is in other words, the first question I had was was Oppenheimer the first Anthony Fauci? And then my second question was is this movie about Anthony Fauci?
That's what I was actually going to bring up. That's so yeah, was he the first Fauci? Except actually, but actually the leader in his field, which I actually don't know but I never got the impression Fauci was actually that smart. But the author of the book, the American Prometheus book, he, in this little interview, it was an NPR interview that I was listening to. He explicitly says, he's like, and we see this today with Anthony Fauci, who's devoted his life thanklessly to scientific service, and now members of Congress have the audacity to question him. So that's what the author of the book definitely believes.
Yeah, and I believe that's so funny because like I'm sure the public doesn't know this, but I'm fairly certain that Anthony Fauci now and for many years, probably decades, makes about 3 times what members of Congress makes and is one of, the highest paid public officials. So like it's not even a correct characterization to be like, oh, these fancy powerful people like coming down on like the family man with a modest house. It's like he makes like 650 or something.
It is the peasants surrounding the baron's house with the torches and the pitchforks, and like you can maybe have some sympathy for the baron if you want to, but he's the baron. He's not the peasant. He's not the witch in the witch trial. And I think shit, I lost it. Never mind. Cut this. Move on.
I was just going to bring in one thing about the author of that book. I also saw that New York Times article, which just made me laugh. It was perfect. It was, he compares the McCarthyite forces to Trump and his ilk today. Talks about Roy Cohn, which is a common thing that libs love to focus on now. A great way to just kind of like tar the rubes, and then he makes a case for us making sure that we have scientists as public intellectuals. And the funny thing too about Byrd is he also tried to exonerate Alger Hiss, which, Oppenheimer, there's a steady debate, and there's like documents. There's a single document where he's kind of identified as working with the KGB, but then there's all this but like Alger Hiss has nothing like that. I mean, it's like a slam dunk. Alger Hiss is guilty. Like there's just so much evidence to that Alger Hiss, Venona, there's eyewitness testimony. I mean, Whitaker Chambers and everything like that. It's just, there's really no question that Alger Hiss was a Soviet agent. And was a very influential one at that. He was at Yalta. But like Kay Byrd's writing books trying to exonerate Alger Hiss. And so like, even if you were really taken by American Prometheus, and I'm sure it's a fine book, it might be interesting, maybe the footnotes and stuff. But it's interesting that Byrd is taking this burden on, why is it so important to him to identify these martyrs that happened to all be communists during this time? Oppenheimer maybe was that autist who couldn't quite make the pivot, like Bennett said. But like someone like Alger Hiss is not even remotely close to that. And I think that this kind of speaks to the issue of this mythos that we have to kind of cling to, that I think Christopher Nolan is a lot more rooted than other directors. And so I kind of, I expect that he'll be a little more thoughtful. But it's interesting that we have to we have to cling to this still. We'll tell the story. We can't quite let go of it, even though we know it's riddled with problems.
There's a criticism of Nolan, which is similar to the criticism of Oppenheimer, which is that he's so concerned with the technical and the craft of whatever it is he's doing that some of the themes in some of his movies sometimes get a little goofy or something like, or because he gets accused of he's very casually accused of like fascism or the Dark Knight was fascist or something, and then now you could make the accusation that he's soft on mid-century American commies or something. I think he might be a little bit like Oppenheimer in that he just cares about making a movie and that he isn't that good at like understanding political nuance or something. I don't know. He's obviously smart. He's an incredibly smart guy, but some people just don't register those things.
Well, and it would be really hard for him to. Oh, apologies. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say it would be very difficult to contradict that narrative in Hollywood as it stands. I would like, let's suppose that Nolan wanted to be a little less delicate with that angle with Oppenheimer. I doubt that he would be allowed to make a film like that.
Yeah. And I think also it's entirely possible that he just sort of accepted the narrative of that was presented in American Prometheus. One of the things that I did want to point out, though, this is where I was trying to go a second ago. Lewis Strauss, the conflict between Lewis Strauss and Oppenheimer is depicted as though it were Lewis Strauss trying to create a circus in order to tar Oppenheimer's reputation and destroy him personally over some resentments and some slights, right? And if you read up on like where Lewis Strauss was at with all this stuff, like first of all, there's the scene where they act like Lewis Strauss is kind of faking the funk because they're like, oh, you pronounce it Strauss, so people won't know you're Jewish. But like Lewis Strauss was like majorly out and proud, like extremely openly Jewish, certainly for the time. And it was actually Oppenheimer who was accused of being like assimilationist and trying to hide out and sort of denying his identity. And then when the thrust of the third act is that Lewis Strauss is trying to embarrass and destroy Oppenheimer, that I think is actually the reverse was true as well. Oppenheimer. So basically, Lewis Strauss had Oppenheimer followed and had watched Oppenheimer make some suspicious contacts, and there was so many elements of like he was constantly stonewalling on the H-bomb, and so the implicit argument in the movie is that like he opposed the H-bomb kind of like either because it wasn't his thing or maybe because he had this sincere moral problem with it. I find that a lot less persuasive even in the context of the movie. But basically when the interrogators, for lack of a better term, ask him like, why do you have this sudden moral compunction about the H-bomb when obviously the A-bomb can do the same thing to the planet? Like there's mutually assured destruction either way. Why do you have this sudden moral compunction? And Lewis Strauss essentially had that same question and was watching Oppenheimer over and over make these calls that like didn't make sense from a from a coherent like ideological perspective, assuming he was a loyal American, but they made perfect sense if he was, essentially trying to weaken America's position relative to the Soviet Union. And so he reached out to Oppenheimer privately and was like, hey, we're probably not going to renew your clearance. And Oppenheimer chose this path of going through the hearing and being very loud about it publicly for the purpose of portraying himself as somebody who was being hard done by the government. And so like kind of my question about the third act is like, because they explain manipulation of procedural outcomes really like explicitly in the movie. Lewis Strauss does. But I look at that and I'm like, who's manipulating the procedural outcomes here? Who is, sort of doing the media manipulation game? And I basically see even if you haven't like done the reading, if you haven't like looked into the history of this, even from the movie's own perspective, it's like the story they're telling doesn't make a ton of sense.
Right. Plus, if you live your life in a way where someone wants to make a 3-hour libtard hagiography about you, like clearly you were the cultural manipulator with the long game. But
right.
like another thing that doesn't work for me about the portrayal of Strauss, and I'm just going to say Strauss because I can't say it the other way, is when Ehrenreich sort of catches him for like secretly wanting to down Oppenheimer, he's like, well, let me tell you something, kid. Like the first rule of politics, you don't want to be the one holding the knife. It's like, so wait a minute. This guy is a master manipulator who never shows anybody what he's doing, but he's also disclosing his real, true, secret motives to the like congressional staffer that he's known for 10 minutes. Like that doesn't make any sense.
Well, that's one of those criticisms where Robert Downey Jr.'s, I think everyone sort of acknowledged. I personally think he did a great job, and everyone sort of acknowledges that. But some of the writing he's given to work with is probably the worst of the movie.
Yeah, they're lucky they had such an excellent actor, because I think if they had anyone less capable, how retarded some of the dialogue would have stood out way more.
Oh, and by the way, the climax where the commie scientist denounces Strauss in front of the hearing and nukes his career, and the fact where and the parts of the movie where Strauss is like boiling with resentment because he thinks that Oppenheimer tarnished his image in front of Einstein. Oppenheimer absolutely was like snickering with the other genius physicists behind Strauss's back about what a dilettante he was and what a, kind of a lobby he was. And like, not necessarily for like genius Machiavellian political reasons, but like clearly as an effort to build coalitions against what Strauss wanted to do politically. And like it, so the idea that was all in Strauss's head is like, I don't know, if I was like Strauss's kid, this movie would really piss me off, I think.
Right, and that might be more evidence, Bennett, of Oppenheimer's like somewhat Machiavellian sophistication. Like, if he saw, and the movie does sort of suggest this, that in some cases waging a moral crusade in public would be less effective than trying to get everyone to believe that the problem with Strauss was that he was incapable of understanding the science at a level that one might need to set the policy, and that like that would be an effective undermining. And like, does anybody know if sort of Oppenheimer's humiliation of Strauss at the export control hearings is a real anecdote?
Yeah, that really happened, and I haven't been able to find details about which isotopes they were discussing, but like there are absolutely isotopes that need to be export controlled because they are valuable in the manufacture of nuclear weapons. And it was just sort of like that's portrayed as more and more evidence of basically just setting up the pins for Strauss's perfidy and what a resentful bad guy he is. But it's actually more evidence of Oppenheimer having essentially divided loyalties.
Well, and you had that quote in your podcast that something Robert Downey Jr. had said, like he's like, I read this as Strauss being the good guy or a good guy.
Yeah. Apparently, he told Christopher Nolan, like, I think I might be on like Strauss's side here. And apparently, Nolan said, "Well, that'll make a really interesting dialogue." Like I think that lends credence to your theory that like Nolan's like just a filmmaker's filmmaker, and he's like, "Oh, well, I'm glad that you have something that will inform your interpretation of the character and make it more genuine. Like, good for you. I don't care."
Yeah, I'm trying to find there's an old quote. I guess Robert Downey Jr. says he didn't say this anymore, or he said he doesn't remember saying it. But there, he went to jail, right? There was this quote where he said something like, if you were a rich guy who went to jail for drugs, you don't come out as a liberal," or something like that. I can't remember where it.
Yeah, and he even had a funny line at the end where he sort of like, or at least it seems reading it now, that he knew he was on shaky ground, and he was like, "I'm not going to go into it further, but like it is what it is." But yeah, he says, I think it's something like, you don't go from being, a rich guy snorting lines in Beverly Hills to in Gen Pop and then come out and still be a liberal, which actually is like, I was laughing so much when I read it, because it's like, it's so devastating, I think, because on the one hand, it has no political content, but what he's actually saying is like, yeah, if you make contact with the real human race, like you will not come out a libtard. It's like, I'm going to try to incorporate some version of it into my repertoire because I think it's so implicitly insulting. It's really delightful.
Yeah, you don't work. You don't work in the content mines or something. Yeah. Okay. On this topic of Robert Downey Jr. Yeah, I think he did great, and yeah, I think he saved some more troubling dialogue and stuff like that. Who else did you guys like? who else do you think really worked in this movie?
Just real quick, I've got the quote. You can't go from a 2000 a night suite at Le Mirage to a penitentiary and really understand it and come out a liberal. You can't. I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone else, but it was very, very, very educational for me and has informed my proclivities in politics ever since.
Yeah, and I think recently he was asked at some point during the Avengers run if he really said that, and he kind of says he doesn't remember or whatever. But let's for the official view of this podcast is that he did say that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
the implication of his silence is that while the political environment of the 1990s was annoying and required you to be somewhat demure, it's now just totalitarian, and he can't even make sort of like vague political indications like that.
All right, yeah, but who else? I mean, I think he did a great job. Who else did a great job, or did anyone not? I mean, some of the praise of this movie is just that everyone was perfect for their role.
Well, yeah, I was saying before the podcast, I think it does add to the heft of a movie to have like really capable, famous, well-known actors, even in the pretty small roles. I think everybody loved Teller. I thought Casey Affleck managed to be sort of like startling and frightening despite being on screen very little. And, this is super boring, but I thought Cillian Murphy was excellent. I think, again, like, it's funny because we all said we liked the movie, and we've spent this whole time talking about what's so annoying about it. But I think part of the reason it's able to get away with all this is that Cillian Murphy is really compelling, and like it's interesting to watch him go through the various phases of his experience with this process. And I think if it had been similar to what I said about Strauss, if there had been any worse of a performance in that lead role, I think the whole thing would fall apart.
We might have to revoke your Irish card.
Am I supposed to say
Cillian Murphy?
Killian?
It's Killian.
Yeah, it's Killian.
Whatever, dog. I'm an American.
Well, Lee called him Levi Strauss, who makes blue jeans. So.
Yeah, I remember while we were talking, I'm like, oh no, it was Louis Strauss. Oh, geez. Yeah. No, I wanted to say one thing. I thought the cast was pretty great. I mean, the acting was amazing. The only part was probably Strauss's aide, but it wasn't really his fault, like you already said. One actor who I thought was really great in this was I think it was Jason Clarke, who played Roger Robb who was kind of interrogating Oppenheimer, his wife, and all of his associates. I mean, they kind of laid it on thick, but I mean, he just knocked it out of the park during that. I thought he did. Like, there's so many, like you brought in Casey Affleck, but there's all of these small, short roles that they do such a great job that it really sends the film through the roof. I mean, the acting in it's great. I thought Josh Hartnett was pretty good too. I mean, I was surprised by that. I thought he did a great job.
Yeah, what's weird is, granted, you were saying like, Nolan is only interested in making a good movie, but there are some of these characters that I think if he had even played them, like 10% more sympathetic just in terms of their own perspective, like the movie would have been an even greater like triumph, because especially the Josh Hartnett character, it's like they sort of make him seem a little bit like a dick, but like if you actually just write down what he does, he's like maybe the most sympathetic guy in the film, where he's like definitely a patriot who's like both genuinely worried about Oppenheimer's loyalties at certain point, but also like a pretty good friend to him who tries to keep him out of trouble. Like, I do think Nolan is at times showing his ideological preferences just in the fact that like you don't come away being like, oh, Josh Hartnett's character was like the best man in the movie, because like this guy was trying to navigate, loyalties of country and association, and like managing to sort of do it and come out with his soul. But like the movie sort of, I think, portrays him as like a little bit of a try hard and a scold, or like a square or something. And
I wondered if so one thing about this is like, you know, they had to hire Oppenheimer. I guess they felt like they needed to hire Oppenheimer to oversee this. And I don't know if that's because they thought he was like the smartest guy, or because he had the respect of the people who he would need to recruit or something. Because in watching it, I was like, why didn't they just have Ernest Lawrence lead this? You know, or did he not have enough clout with these European Jews who he needed to recruit or something?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is Oppenheimer did have other talents. I mean, first of all, he had the respect of the community that he was trying to lead. I think that they did a good job showing that in the film. I mean, he was the one who really brought this revolutionary physics over to the United States and planted a flag in Berkeley. That was a big deal within that community, you know, and so
Well,
he
I think
did have that.
in terms of personnel too, it's like all the main physicists working on it seem to have grown up within a few square miles of each other, and their great grandparents, you know, probably grew up within a few square miles of each other in Hungary or something. So he seemed to know all the right guys initially.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
think
you know,
I think one thing that's true of Oppenheimer that was also true of Einstein is like, and it feels like, and Lee was saying this, that we don't have people like this anymore. But, you know, Einstein always said, like, before he could do the math, he sort of had almost like visions. Like he would sort of see in his mind how the universe worked, and then put that back into the theory. And I think I've read something about Oppenheimer, and certainly how the movie portrays him is that like he had sort of like an intuitive understanding of how a nuclear explosive might work, and everybody else had like a more compartmentalized. I think scientists do think that if you have that sort of like abstract, like you have the visions of how the most abstract and, you know, seemingly incoherent theory could be put into practice, like that's something they really respect, because I think it is often particularly rare among scientific type minds who can, you know, break things down into component parts and never really see the bigger picture. But sorry for interrupting you, Lee.
no, that was a fantastic point, because I think that you know, if you dig into Oppenheimer's relationship with Lawrence, who's Josh Hartnett's character, they're polar opposites. You know, Lawrence is like, I think his parents are from Norway. You know, he grows up in the Midwest. He's very conservative, very subdued. You know, he likes, you know, he values his home life. Not really into like crazy art or weird scenes or anything like that. So he's a very like almost, I mean, I don't want to say bland, but he kind of has that Midwest, just very like kind of down home type. And then Oppenheimer's the exact opposite. Oppenheimer likes flashy cars. He likes the, you know, the crazy colors. He goes to these commie meetings and all this stuff. They're just total opposites. But, you know, Oppenheimer did, to give him credit, I mean, he did have this, it wasn't just flair, you know, he really did have a creative genius alongside his scientific ability that just made him, not only is he respected, not only is he a theoretical physicist, so he's able to be flexible in a creative place that other scientists, engineers just can't really venture, you know. And so like I wondered during the film, I don't think that they would be able to do this again. I don't think that a Manhattan Project of that size and scope, of what it would require, the speed that they would need to do this while they're racing other nations and scientists in other countries. I don't think that as much as we'd be able to do that today. And one of the things I wondered is, would they have picked somebody like Lawrence, who I think Lawrence is, I mean, if you read about him, he's an incredible mind, great scientist, he really made huge contributions even prior to Oppenheimer taking over Los Alamos. But the whole thing about it, though, is that I wonder if someone like Lawrence would be a shoo-in for a project like this today, and someone like Oppenheimer wouldn't even be in the running. not even be considered.
Right, and that's part of why the warp speed comparison is so annoying, because it's like that's a logistical triumph, but you didn't need someone at the center of it to sort of have a Promethean vision. Like they sequenced the thing in a day.
Well, I like the warp speed comparison too because, Oppenheimer was at least a proven intellect. He accomplished things. As far as I'm aware, like Fauci, which this might actually get me kicked off YouTube, but you're not supposed to talk about Fauci. But Fauci, what was his claim to fame up to that point? Like exacerbating the AIDS crisis?
His great scientific innovation was insisting that heterosexuals were just as likely to get AIDS as homosexuals, which no one had dared to offer such a confounding theory at the time.
And that's really like the whole thing is like Fauci, at all due respect, but he's first and foremost really a bureaucrat. You couldn't put him in a room with somebody like Oppenheimer. They're not even on the same plane. And it isn't just because Fauci's the medical field and Oppenheimer's a physicist. There's just no comparison to these two. But you just don't see Oppenheimers today, unless maybe in the private sector that you might find some rare types like this here and there. You will never find them running a project of this importance in the government ever.
They're guessing geolocation spots and playing Dwarf Fortress and, and building computers in Minecraft. That's what those guys are
making
nice
making Biggie Slonk edits. But it's it is funny because it's like, Fauci, even like the concept of public health is like this abomination that allows, supposedly, sectoral experts. But it's like, if people in public health, it's like, none of them are real doctors. Like, you wouldn't let any of them give you a shot. And like, I don't know if similar things have happened to physics. Like, I don't know if there's an equivalent of like public physics.
Well, like Neil deGrasse Tyson is like the face of physics now, and I doubt he's like a real physicist.
Yeah. That seems like a good comp.
It's like, Lee was talking about Jason Clarke as Roger Robb. I looked up that guy's Rob's Wikipedia the other day, and there's some cool details about him. He as a lawyer, he'd represented Goldwater in a libel suit and won, and then he retired from the let's see. Well, actually, he was on the circuit court for DC, and when he moved on, he was replaced by Scalia. So pretty cool.
Yeah, it's very funny to imagine a scene where just like, Roger Robb's grandson or something sees the movie and like asks his parents like what was going on, and they're just like, "Don't worry, they were all actual communists." Like,
well, yeah, it's funny because you're right. Roger Robb does. He kind of fits this perfect villain. Him not only the Barry Goldwater connection, but he was really the deciding factor in Oppenheimer being stripped of his security clearance. And then later, I think wasn't he nominated by Richard Nixon later on? So he's got the Nixon tie as well.
Appointed by Nixon to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, and then by Nixon.
And then Scalia. So you have like this genealogy of just like the worst person ever.
All the libtard villain.
Yeah.
It's so weird too. It's like totally unrelatable. It just seems so magical to be like, oh, like they weren't a majority, but there was a time like in your parents' life where there were these people peppered around government, motivated by a hatred of an ideology that was actually bad and a threat. It's like, I can't even imagine what that would have felt like.
Yeah, it's just so funny how you can hold these two opinions where it's like you can look around you, and this is why it's so hard for me to stomach sometimes. Like there are people out there, and a lot of them, who can look around and say this giant thing that one day we celebrate and we see as the pinnacle of progress and of our triumph, but also we are these misunderstood victims as well. This this thing is not ours. Everything bad that's happening is coming from the hinterlands, and that, like, even to think that at that time, to think that these forces within the bureaucratic state were like these very like conservative Bible thumping types. Like, it's so beyond reality, but it is such a powerful mythos today. Like, not only are we winning all the time, but we're also like we are also in danger all the time of these very powerful forces. But they're also very stupid, right? They're stupid, they're unethical, but at the same time they're very powerful. They're conniving. I mean, I don't know how you can hold these two things in your head at the same time. I don't know how you could look at like something like World War II and be like, what happened is we allowed these crazy conservatives to take over and make all these terrible decisions, but we also won the greatest war ever. FDR was a great president, but at the same time, like, we were controlled by this conservative block of leaders. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, but people believe this, and that's why these kind of narratives are just they totally fit in and nobody notices them. You can eat your popcorn and enjoy it.
I don't think they actually think about it at a granular level, but like, if you challenge them, because that's such a good point, that like their whole conceit of history is all these victories, and like the history you learn in high school is just like these victories over the WASPs, the Christians, the white man who is always the secret power center of America. But it's like, well, if the history we all know is a story of overcoming them, then like at what point does the null hypothesis that they are always in control of everything go away? And it's like, well, never. But I guess they probably would say, maybe some people would say, like, they actually think like, oh, well, every time there's like a George W. Bush, everything we accomplished got like rolled back. And like, you can just, walk around in America and see that that's obviously not the case. But I guess, that's why Joe Biden says Mitt Romney gonna put y'all back in chains or whatever.
So
that's a good point, because and I think this goes back to the author of American Prometheus. It's like, Kay Bird makes this very impassioned plea to people to allow science. We've got to defeat these McCarthyite forces. Like, they're still here. They're still dangerous, and they still hold down these, they're trying to destroy science, and they're trying to destroy, progress, and this, that, and the other. And so like the fear is always there. And so like when we see things like I've always wondered, this indifference we have. Yeah, we have a giant censorship regime. We all know we're being surveilled. Yeah, they're jailing people for memes, but like, we know that it's really the McCarthyite forces. And so like, this is necessary and good. And so, yes, I can stomach this, and I can go watch Oppenheimer, and I can be, taken away by, the martyrdom by these forces. But like, I can also like look down and say, I'm glad that they jailed this guy for making a meme. I'm glad that, these crazy conservatives are getting their own comeuppance in a security review, and they're getting booted out of the military or wherever else. Maybe that's how it is. Maybe there is a consistency.
I do want to say in defense of Kai Bird, just that if you're a white man in America and your parents name you Kai, you're going to grow up and write defenses of Alger Hiss. That's just how it works. He didn't have a chance.
The way that I think you still view yourself as the underdog when you're controlling every human institution is you go to war with reality. Because in the fight against injustice, the fight against inequality, the fight against the laws of thermodynamics, they are still outmatched, and they are the fact they can recontextualize, hey, all this shit we're trying isn't working. They can recontextualize that as like, oh, we're so surrounded and threatened and outnumbered, because I really think that if you were to scratch them, if you were to ask, what they would point to is like, well, but there's still, so much disparate impact and so many, outcomes that aren't going the way that our models say they should. And the sea levels are still rising. And therefore, like that's prima facie evidence of the fascist conspiracy and the wreckers that that are undermining everything we're trying to accomplish. And so I don't think that they see themselves genuinely as like being in control of the situation, because the task they've set themselves is Sisyphean. It can't be done.
No, I think you're exactly right. And if you think about it, if you're a misunderstood genius who got stuffed in a locker, or you're one of these artist types who leads a beautiful life, and you have to be surrounded by these grotesque, big gulp drinking people who don't understand your specialness or whatever it is. There's millions of people like this, but I think there's a sense of feeling alienated and like an island. And so even, you can hold these two things together because in a way, like you said, that there is a sense of being outnumbered and outmatched. It's interesting in a film like this that you can, even as the viewer, as you're watching Oppenheimer go through this, that you kind of feel that same sense, even though, I mean, we're dealing with a very celebrated scientist. He was working for consulting firms. I mean, there's a shot of him with the Rand Corporation, but like even when he got his security clearance stripped, I mean, he was making a lot of money, and he was still like he was a very popular figure. I mean, it wasn't like his life was ruined. And I know that they have to kind of play up the drama for that, but it is interesting that you can still capture that sense even with a celebrity like Oppenheimer. I think that kind of speaks to some truth today that we see with this sense of victimization.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. One last thing I was just going to, didn't mean to cut you off. One last thing I was going to say though, about the martyr thing is I do like his wife in this film. Some people haven't liked Emily Blunt in this. I thought she was actually really good, but I like her character because she's very cold. She's flinty, and she calls him out several times, like almost identifies exactly, like she pinpoints exactly the problem, and she, like when he's feeling sorry for himself after his girlfriend commits suicide, and she basically kind of like shakes him out and it's like, you don't get to do this because you've already hurt all these people and all these people are relying on you and you're a giant mess and like you're feeling sorry for yourself. I did like that. That was actually something that like I felt was really good that Nolan brought in, because it wasn't just kit glove treatment with, the tortured artist. It was actually kind of brutal, and the wife seemed to be the person to deliver that. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I always like Emily Blunt, but I just wanted to say about the sort of war with reality thing. I think another interesting dynamic here that the film portrays is that like this is sort of this way of fighting with reality and not acknowledging power when you have it. I think this is part of the power of the immigrant to the American system, because you can bring people here and empower them sort of to levels that a normal person could never understand. But as long as they feel sort of, it's almost like a built-in like prevention code for lacking noblesse oblige, where it's like if you're actually from the place, embedded with the people, you will have like a natural sense of responsibility. But like if you're an outsider with like slightly different cultural folkways or whatever, you will be able to ascend to immense positions of power without feeling truly accepted. And this can make you like, you will never stop being ambitious. You will never stop subverting, to use like a catchword. And I think like only sort of like a newcomer can foment that kind of pathology, which is ultimately like extremely valuable to this system.
On that Emily Blunt thing, those are good points, Degree Study. Sorry, I was just thinking about the Emily Blunt comment that Lee had, and I think she was really good. I think her performance was very, very good, although I will say it's possibly the worst she's ever looked. I mean, that was, by design, but That's
She has
tough.
to live with John Krasinski. It's tough times.
Yeah, but I was reading about her the real life wife of Oppenheimer, and they downplay the craziness quite a bit for the movie. She was even a bigger drinker than they portray, and frequently drove drunk and had a lot of problems.
My one complaint about like Florence Pugh, I didn't believe her as a crazy person. Like she was like way too put together and in control in every scene she was in, and then she was like, "Oh, I'm nuts and I have to kill myself off screen." And
No, go to Dime Square. There's women who can do that.
Well, I heard today though as well. This was not the kind of source that would it was some sort of normie thing I was listening to. I can't remember what it was. It wasn't NPR, but something like that. They were saying that Jean Tatlock, when her father discovered her body, he quickly burned a bunch of her like correspondence with Oppenheimer and maybe others, and it was all they were implying it was all very suspicious and that she may not have killed herself.
Yeah, well, I know that that's always kind of captured my attention is that he burned. If I'm not mistaken, he actually burned all of her correspondence before contacting the police.
Yeah, it was before the police. Yeah, that was
right.
Isn't the simpler explanation that she just made reference to being a huge communist?
I've wondered that too. Well, and we do know that she knew Oppenheimer was working on some pretty important stuff. So there's like, and I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, he was connected to some of those shady contacts that they brought up during his security review. They were associates of his wife and his girlfriend. So there were two angles to this where he was kind of in the middle. And it sounds to me like she was definitely a true believer. And when I think her parents knew about it because they were also kind of tied into this, the whole Chevrolet, thing, the issue, which they brought that up, but I don't think that they did it justice to what actually happened. This was all tied in together into a web. And so I've always kind of taken the approach that it was probably the communist ties and that the father knew what this would mean for Oppenheimer, but also others that she was associated with. But I've never heard that she might not have actually killed herself, because it was a strange way to do it. She basically drowned her own self in the bathtub, which just people don't typically do it that way. So
yeah,
I thought that was supposed to be impossible. But I have one Emily Blunt question, and it might just be my media illiteracy, but I did not understand the scene where she's kind of like girl bossing her testimony. Like they set it up like everyone's worried that she's not going to do well, but then she has this very odd interaction with Roger Robb, and I guess all I took from it was like, oh, they were worried she was a liability, and then she did well, but like in the actual scene, she is acting like a weirdo.
Yeah, if you look on Twitter, everyone's like, "Oh, she ate that up." Like she ate that, like, or she looked at that interview, man, and she just ate it, or whatever they say. She served it. I don't remember. I don't know how they're talking, but like, I'm like, no, she just is very obnoxious. Like she's just correcting him on like grammar, because like that's what you would do if you were guilty, and you would just try and deflect to like other dumb issues.
Right. They do this in movies a lot where like being an indignant and combative witness is like shown in previous scenes by other characters to not be effective and to in fact be how like the prosecutor or whatever gets one up on you. But then they have a character they like just do it, and like the music changes and the focus is different, and you're apparently supposed to just be like, oh yeah, she got that. But like even the thing she was saying, I didn't really I didn't understand like what it would accomplish in the context of this hearing for her to demonstrate to Rob that she has like a better handle of grammar than he. like that would seem transparently counterproductive and pointless.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's like everybody knows that they're going to go down with the ship, and so it's just a way of sticking it to these dummies.
So she's just getting her licks in because
basically.
because she's more shark-eyed than her husband.
Right.
What did we think of Matt Damon? Degree studies. You had a good. I kind of thought of him. He was like the Gentile stand-in for the audience. He's like, he's trying to he's trying to like manage, these Jewish physicists, but he sort of like has that. And Lawrence has kind of a similar role too. But what did you guys think of Damon's like character and performance?
Yeah, I think they got closer with Damon to making you think at times like, oh, is this actually the secret hero of the movie that like I kind of wanted them to do with Josh Hartnett, but they didn't. But yeah, I think because I suspect, and I haven't read the history as you guys have, but just watching the movie, I sort of came to my own conclusion of like, oh, I suspect this guy in real life knew exactly what he had in Oppenheimer, that he probably was a communist, that he was like difficult and retarded, and that like he couldn't be trusted beyond a certain point, but that he had unique intellectual gifts that needed to be used. And I think like probably also that historical guy, if you could ask him like, will Oppenheimer be happy with how this goes? Like once the bomb leaves Los Alamos, he'd be like, oh no, like they never are. But like that's why you bring in me. Like I sort of delude the scientists and build like a esprit de corps or whatever, and then we get what we need. So yeah, I think and I think what I was saying to you, Granted, is like there's another movie in here that I think would be very interesting and more nationalist, that's about Matt Damon as sort of like this frustrated manager who's like, okay, I have all these crazy immigrants who like aren't even loyal to the country, but I need to motivate them to get this bomb done. And then like you just tell his story.
Yeah, I demand my Presbyterian Manhattan Project movie.
Make it an office comedy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved. I felt like they did a good job of capturing kind of there's a tendency to look at these systems like they have a spirit, and that they, an evil spirit that hates you, that is evil, and yes, we can have our complaints about, what these systems do and how inhuman they are. But, I think that Matt Damon did a good job standing in for that military viewpoint and perspective, because it's not personal. It's like, we got to get the job done. And yeah, if we have to like step on you, if I have to eventually, like, I'm going to hold. I like that they brought in that Matt Damon had, he's dealing with this, flamboyant, intelligent physicist who's kind of a rock star in his community. But at the end of the day, like, who holds the goods? It's Matt Damon's character, because it's not just, being a genius scientist. It doesn't, you're not going to, somebody's holding the bag. And, at the end of the day, Matt Damon's got him in the palm of his hand, and he did. And he used the leverage, and they bring that into some of their interactions, that eventually Oppenheimer realizes that, like, his good friend over here who will go to bat for him when he needs to, but like his primary focus is that mission, and he's holding leverage over him and everybody else there the entire time. And that it's not necessarily like a personal problem, even at the end when he's in the security review and Groves gives his testimony, it's not personal. It's mission focused, and he was being honest, and I thought that Damon did a good job of doing that, but also kind of just showing the impersonal nature of these systems that are oriented around, in maybe a military setting. I mean, they're there to win. I mean, that's what it all comes down to. At the end of the day, like, if we have to break some eggs, if we have to like lose a friendship here or there, if you don't get your gold star, or you don't get to work at the Rand Corporation, like, that's just how it goes. And I felt like Damon did a really good job of kind of delivering that perspective where you still sympathize with him, but you don't see him as a villain.
Yeah, and I think, like what you said about Emily Blunt's character, I think they show Damon sort of hanging with Oppenheimer and calling him on his bullshit, which all the other guys can't. Like, I think one of my favorite exchanges in the movie is I think it's the first interaction between them, and Oppenheimer sort of snidely says, if you're such hot shit, why aren't you a general? And he says, they're going to make me a general for this.
Yeah, he struck me as very canny, and I definitely liked him. I enjoyed him the most of all the characters in the movie.
Well,
He was the
yeah.
most fun to watch.
I really like Degree Studies' take about Leslie Groves. He's orchestrating. He's getting all these like dissident academics together, and who think they're being very sneaky and clever by spying. And he's like, I knew some percent of whatever they were doing was going to leak, but it was about speed to market, and we just had to do it. And like them thinking they're spying, but he like knows everything. I think that's a funny way to think of it.
Because I mean, they weren't particularly like careful. Like they weren't like Oppenheimer. They're all still running like commie meetings, like in Los Alamos in the secure compound, and like that. They were, and for him, he's got to sort of pretend to buy their story just to like not have a fight. Like, okay, please just keep building the bomb. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, have you guys ever been in a situation? Because I couldn't remember exactly what it is, but I have been in a situation like this where there's a scene where Matt Damon walks in and is like, you guys know you have to remain compartmentalized, right? And they're like, yes. And then the scientist who starts talking, I don't think it's Oppenheimer, literally starts his thing where he's like, well, based on what the general just said, like, I'm not supposed to share this with you, but I'm going to because you need to know it. And it just sort of cuts back to Damon being frustrated. And, like, that is an incredibly common, like, in any government work, that's an incredibly common dynamic between, like, the subject matter people who have been brought in and then, like, the people who are responsible for, like, security or procedure. But it's weird to think that they would have been so glib about that, like in wartime on this project. But that does seem consistent with, like, Oppenheimer's character and perhaps the culture he cultivated.
Yeah, I'm not sure that prior to like the Rosenbergs, that like everybody really understood, like, in my experience in like secure contexts, people take that shit very seriously because they are thinking very personally about going to Leavenworth. And I think maybe because the security state was so new, I'm not sure everybody involved really felt like it would actually happen for them, or what maybe wasn't real to them that you could be imprisoned or hanged for running your mouth.
Yeah, I think it was 1947 is where you see this change. And that's when finally, it finally sinks into the American public and to the Truman administration that, like, we're dealing with a potential war now with the Soviets. And it was kind of mostly like the crazies and the blood and guts kind of types that were worrying about this before. Patton, MacArthur, they were, this was on their mind. But, like, for much of the public and for even many of these bureaucrats, it was just inconceivable that things would go to that point. And so suddenly, Truman inherits this massive, it's just a giant mess. I mean, this is like he's getting the tail end of a massive war in which the United States was just, giving like you brought in before, Bennett, just giving everything over to the Soviets, generously giving away intelligence, allowing working with Soviets. They were even thinking about planning operations with the NKVD and stuff. And, like, you have Hoover with the FBI, who's kind of like on his own. He's like on an island, and he hears about the Manhattan Project as he's, like, tailing some of these scientists, and turns out that, like, some of them are talking to KGB agents, and he's like, that's where he finds out about the Manhattan. Everything is so siloed. There's no communication. It's all like this makeshift government that does not have any security protocols that make any sense. Like, it's very porous. And so the next thing you know, like 1947, like this is where you start getting like loyalty oaths and things like that. This is where like a lot of the big hearings start to come out with the House of Un-American Activities. Like finally people are getting a grasp of what the extent of Soviet espionage has been throughout the war, when we were good allies. And so like I thought that was a little strange. I mean, they were much more cautious with the Manhattan Project and Los Alamos than they were with other things that were going on. But the big emphasis on security and the Ruskies and all this, like that really wasn't a thing. There wasn't this big fear that the Soviets were going to be stealing things. Like people hadn't really thought about that. And so I thought that was kind of funny and maybe it's just because of the nature that we live in now, like the security state is incredibly secure and all this stuff really started in 47. So it's like, I don't know if it's just hard to transcend that, but like it was the Wild West back then.
We are kind of up on the amount of time I have. So I think I'll cut it off about here. I mean, this was, in my opinion, a huge movie. There's a ton more we could talk about. There's a lot of performances. Can I ask
one question to the group?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I think it's pretty quick. I just wanted to ask, because we were talking about it earlier, like, and this occurred to me, the movie sort of ends with Oppenheimer saying, like, we don't know what we've unleashed and this will go bad. But I was thinking to myself, like, is the reason that climate change hysteria exists because nuclear deterrence has been so effective? Like, in other words, like there always needs to be an extinction scenario, and like it was actually sort of a problem for governance that like the one at hand was growing less and less credible, and so there needed to be like a new extinguishing force.
Yeah, sounds right to me.
The timing, I was in elementary school in 1992. And I can remember global warming kind of instantaneously becoming the thing and being something that we were told about ad nauseum at school. And so like just from that perspective, it certainly tracks. And I think you need a totalizing threat to execute totalizing policy objectives. So yeah, I'll buy that for $1.
And I think I think there's a lot of truth to that, because we're really living in like the wreckage of this like Cold War project where we had really, really serious people trying to solve really, really serious problems. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, we're left with this giant monstrosity that nobody really knows like what to do with. And we also, we don't really need to be as cautious and careful with this machinery that we're like wielding. And so it seems like the administrative state gets taken over by these strange, like, I mean, I feel like centuries from now, people will look back and be like, the Americans just kind of went crazy. One day that, they were putting solar panels on all the buildings and they were doing rainbow flags all over, it's just like it's like we need to fight this threat that is supposedly out there, but who knows what it is, and we can't really measure how much progress we're making against these ethereal forces, and so the big fear I have now though is like that seems to be all guns are pointed at the American rubes in the heartland right now, that's the danger. And that's kind of where I think like this film, it's like, what do we do with this thing? We don't really have serious people in positions of power. We don't really have anybody who knows how to like manage this. Even the diplomacy of this massive Cold War government, like no one knows how to actually like really do effective policy here. So like, where are we going? Like what happens next? Like, I don't think we're going to get an Oppenheimer to come in and then push us into this new phase. Like it feels like we're like stuck in a ditch right now, and we might be here for a very, very long time.
Beautiful spot to end on.
All right, yeah, let's leave it at that. We're stuck in a ditch. You are all stuck. Take stock of where you are right now. You're stuck in a ditch. No, that was great. I mean, thanks guys for joining. I genuinely think this is a pretty great movie. It doesn't quite get to like top of the mountain for me, but but it's great. I think it's a more or less our most ambitious living director trying to do something that's big and that to him felt important, and I think there is a lot of important stuff going on there. And I mean, it's worth seeing. I mean, I think when someone makes something like this, it's probably worth checking out and supporting it in some way or another. Definitely go follow all these guys on Twitter. I'll put the links out there. Check out Lee's new article that'll probably be out tomorrow or today when you're listening to this. Check out Bennett's solo podcast about Oppenheimer. It's very good. I'll link to it here. And as always, like and subscribe and all that stuff. Thank you very much, and talk to you later, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Granite.
Thanks.
Thank
It was
you.
fun.